Get ready to dive into history for a good night's rest. But first, do us a solid and hit that like button, then subscribe to the channel. You won't have the strength later, believe me. Now close your eyes. Our story begins. Forget everything you thought you knew about Mozart. No, really. Banish that old image from your mind. The powdered wig, the carefree smile, the music as light as a cloud. It's all a lie. A convenient, beautiful lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. Are you ready for the truth? To the true story of a genius drowning in debt and disgrace? The story of a man who got literally kicked out of his job? A swift boot to the backside, no less? How did it come to pass that Europe's greatest composer, whose operas drove entire cities wild with passion, ended his days in an unmarked pauper's grave? Who was his true enemy? I assure you it wasn't Salieri. The truth is far more terrifying and far closer to home. What darkness lurked behind his divine music? What demons tormented him? And did he, in the ultimate moment, betray the greatest dream of his entire life? Today, we're not just listening to music. We're dissecting a legend. We're picking apart his brain to understand how he achieved what he did. We're poring over his ledger, and I'll prove to you why the starving artist narrative is the biggest con of all. I promise you this. After watching, you will never look at Mozart the same way again. So stick around until the very end. The truth will prove far more complex, dramatic, and utterly shocking than you could possibly imagine. On the 5th of December, in the year 1791, on a brutally cold and dreary day, a minuscule funeral procession wound its way through the streets of Vienna. No more than 5 souls trudged behind a simple pine coffin. No lavish eulogies, no somber music, no throng of mourners. His body was lowered into a communal pauper's grave at St. Mark's Cemetery, and soon a torrential downpour of rain and snow utterly erased the last traces. And so, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was laid to rest. And within this stark fact lies the central paradox we begin with. How could a man whose name was already synonymous with musical genius, whose operas commanded sold-out houses, and whose melodies were hummed across all of enlightened Europe, conclude his journey in an unmarked grave, like a forgotten vagrant? We've grown accustomed to the chocolate box image of Mozart, the powdered wig, the carefree grin, music that feels like the laughter of God transcribed onto a score. Effortless grace, divine inspiration. But beneath this shimmering facade lies a narrative of immense tension, relentless struggle for survival, humiliating debts, and crushing solitude at the pinnacle of his fame. His actual life was infinitely far removed from the harmony of his compositions, and it is precisely in this chasm between myth and reality that the key to understanding his phenomenon truly lies. So, let me immediately clarify the genre of our exploration. This won't be merely a biographical sketch of a child prodigy, nor a sleep-inducing lecture on music history. Rather, it will be a psychological drama about a free spirit's struggle against an imperfect world, an intellectual inquiry into how, amidst relentless chaos, immense pressure, and debilitating illness, the most perfect and harmonious music in human history came into being. Get ready to dive into history for a good night's rest. But first, do us a solid and hit that like button, then subscribe to the channel. You won't have the strength later, believe me. Now close your eyes. Our story begins. Forget everything you thought you knew about Mozart. No, really. Banish that old image from your mind. The powdered wig, the carefree smile, the music as light as a cloud. It's all a lie. A convenient, beautiful lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. Are you ready for the truth? To the true story of a genius drowning in debt and disgrace? The story of a man who got literally kicked out of his job? A swift boot to the backside, no less? How did it come to pass that Europe's greatest composer, whose operas drove entire cities wild with passion, ended his days in an unmarked pauper's grave? Who was his true enemy? I assure you it wasn't Salieri. The truth is far more terrifying and far closer to home. What darkness lurked behind his divine music? What demons tormented him? And did he, in the ultimate moment, betray the greatest dream of his entire life? Today, we're not just listening to music. We're dissecting a legend. We're picking apart his brain to understand how he achieved what he did. We're poring over his ledger, and I'll prove to you why the starving artist narrative is the biggest con of all. I promise you this. After watching, you will never look at Mozart the same way again. So stick around until the very end. The truth will prove far more complex, dramatic, and utterly shocking than you could possibly imagine. On the 5th of December, in the year 1791, on a brutally cold and dreary day, a minuscule funeral procession wound its way through the streets of Vienna. No more than 5 souls trudged behind a simple pine coffin. No lavish eulogies, no somber music, no throng of mourners. His body was lowered into a communal pauper's grave at St. Mark's Cemetery, and soon a torrential downpour of rain and snow utterly erased the last traces. And so, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was laid to rest. And within this stark fact lies the central paradox we begin with. How could a man whose name was already synonymous with musical genius, whose operas commanded sold-out houses, and whose melodies were hummed across all of enlightened Europe, conclude his journey in an unmarked grave like a forgotten vagrant? We've grown accustomed to the chocolate box image of Mozart, the powdered wig, the carefree grin, music that feels like the laughter of God transcribed onto a score. Effortless grace, divine inspiration. But beneath this shimmering facade lies a narrative of immense tension, relentless struggle for survival, humiliating debts, and crushing solitude at the pinnacle of his fame. His actual life was infinitely far removed from the harmony of his compositions. And it is precisely in this chasm between myth and reality that the key to understanding his phenomenon truly lies. So, let me immediately clarify the genre of our exploration. This won't be merely a biographical sketch of a child prodigy, nor a sleep-inducing lecture on music history. Rather, it will be a psychological drama about a free spirit's struggle against an imperfect world, an intellectual inquiry into how, amidst relentless chaos, immense pressure, and debilitating illness, the most perfect and harmonious music in human history came into being. And what truly astounds me here, it's not the tragic ending itself, nor even the divine beauty of his symphonies. It's the sheer audacity of his inner world. Consider this. Around him, a cauldron of debts, intrigues, family tragedies, and physical ailments was boiling over. Yet at that very same moment, his brain, like a perfectly calibrated mechanism, was constructing flawless musical universes where absolute order, logic, and light reigned supreme. This wasn't mere inspiration. It was an incredible inner power that allowed him to wall himself off from brutal reality with a barrier of pure harmony. This poses the pivotal question. Was his genius a divine gift that existed despite all hardships? Or, conversely, was it precisely this constant pressure, this imperative to survive and create at the very limits of human capacity, that became the fuel igniting the fire of his talent? Perhaps his music wasn't an escape from reality, but the only way available to him to impose order on its chaos, transforming pain and suffering into mathematically precise beauty. I invite you to become not just a spectator, but an active participant in this intellectual investigation. Together, we'll endeavor to peek under the hood of this marvel, to analyze the mechanics of his genius, to comprehend the economics of his creative output, and the personal drama that stood behind every single note. Our goal is not merely to unravel the mystery of his music, but also the logic that governed the life of one of the most astonishing individuals to ever walk this earth. To truly grasp Mozart's genius, we need more than just dates and facts. We need to feel his era, to breathe his air. Let's close our eyes for a moment and listen intently to 18th century Vienna. This isn't a quiet museum hall. It's a deafening cacophony, a sonic flood that swallows everything whole. Through the melodic chime of church bells marking time, the relentless clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestone streets pierces the air. It's the rhythmic clip-clop of thousands of horses' hooves, the boisterous shouts of street vendors hawking hot pastries or water, and the distant yet insistent clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Meanwhile, in the grand halls of palaces, an entirely different kind of music unfolds. The rustle of heavy silk gowns, the barely audible tap of satin slippers on polished parquet, and the hushed whispers of gossip concealed behind painted fans. Now, let's take a breath. The air is heavy and thick, especially in the poorer districts. It's a pungent cocktail of odors that would likely make a modern person faint, dead away. The sharp stench of human waste, openly dumped onto the streets from windows, mingles with the smell of horse manure, the sour tang of tavern wine, and the coal smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. Yet, through this pungent curtain, the inviting aroma of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery occasionally breaks through. In aristocratic drawing rooms, however, a completely different world prevailed. Here, the air was thoroughly saturated with the heavy, cloying scent of floral perfumes and powder, which ladies and gentlemen used to mask the odor of unwashed bodies. To this was added the sweet, enveloping scent of melting wax from hundreds of candles illuminating the ballroom. The minds of people in that era were hardwired with several bedrock cultural codes, without grasping which, we'll miss the whole picture. The first and foremost was the idea of a divine hierarchy. You weren't born an aristocrat or a commoner by chance. That was God's divinely ordained order. Between a count and his servant musician, even if that musician was a genius, there was not merely a social divide, but an almost biological chasm. An aristocrat was, in their eyes, a different breed of human. This is precisely why Mozart's conflict with the Archbishop of Salzburg, which culminated in that famous swift boot to the backside, was not just a squabble, but a revolt against the very fabric of the cosmos. The servant dared to demand respect as a true artist, not as mere hired help. The second cultural code, constantly at odds with the first, was the spirit of the Enlightenment. This was an era of unwavering faith in the omnipotence of human reason. Thinkers of the time were convinced that the universe was not chaos, but a perfectly tuned clockwork mechanism engineered by a great master. And this mechanism, they believed, could be understood, disassembled, and even perfected through logic and science. And here's what's truly astonishing. Mozart's music is, in essence, the sonic embodiment of Enlightenment ideals. Its crystalline clarity, mathematical precision, flawless symmetry, and harmony. These are a hymn to reason, capable of imposing order on any chaos. Flowing directly from this is the third code, the patronage system. An artist, poet, or musician in the 18th century could not be free. He was property, an extension of his patron's court. He composed not from inspiration, but on demand, for a dinner, for a festival, for the arrival of esteemed guests. This system offered financial stability, but it stripped away the one thing that mattered most: freedom. And Mozart's entire adult life was a desperate attempt to shatter this system. He refused to be someone's chattel. He wanted to be an entrepreneur, to market his genius directly to the public. And here we arrive at the most fitting and compelling analogy. Mozart's story is the tale of the most audacious creative startup of the 18th century. His father, Leopold, served as the angel investor and producer who poured everything into launching his brilliant venture. And Wolfgang himself, upon moving to Vienna, attempted the impossible. In a world ruled by aristocratic monopolies, he resolved to found his own creative agency. becoming the first independent artist in history to risk working in an open, competitive market without the safety net of a powerful patron. It was a leap into the absolute unknown. The true starting point, the catalyst that ignited an irreversible chain reaction, was one specific day in May of 1781. By this point, the 25-year-old Mozart was already suffocating in Salzburg. The city, which in his childhood had seemed a cozy cradle, had transformed into a cramped, gilded cage. His master was Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo, a cold, pragmatic man, utterly convinced of the inviolability of the established world order. In his frame of reference, Mozart was not a genius, but a highly skilled craftsman, a court servant whose duty was to provide quality music for dinner precisely as a cook provided quality dishes. He was a function, a mere piece of palace inventory, and this role was unbearable for Wolfgang. The final straw was the Archbishop's chilling demand for him to immediately return to the detested Salzburg from Vienna, where Mozart had been reveling in concerts and tasting for the first time a truly unfettered creative life. He flat out refused. A brutal parade of humiliating meetings, heated arguments, and stark ultimatums ensued. Mozart submitted his resignation. It was denied. He submitted it again. And it was then that the definitive event occurred, the symbolic act marking his irrevocable break with the past. The chief steward of the court, Count Arco, a man tasked with ejecting the troublesome musician, could find no better argument, no more eloquent dismissal than to give Mozart a very real, literal kick to the backside. In that precise moment, the servant Mozart ceased to exist, and in his place, Mozart, the free artist, was born. This kick was not merely an insult, it was the audacious flourish with which destiny itself signed his Declaration of Independence. And here, stepping onto the stage, is that very great idea, that driving force of history that altered everything. By moving to Vienna, Mozart didn't simply change his address. He resolved to breathe life into something truly revolutionary and utterly audacious for his era, to become the first freelance composer in history. Understand this clearly. This was nothing like today's shift to remote work. In the 18th century, a creative person had only two stark paths: either secure a wealthy patron and become, in essence, their property, or face the grim certainty of starving to death. A stable salary, housing, food, commissions, all of this was solely provided by the aristocratic employer. To reject this meant stepping fearlessly into the void. Mozart, however, proposed a completely new model. He decided that his genius was not merely a skill, but capital. And he would invest this capital in himself. He would personally organize subscription concerts known as academies, selling tickets directly to the eager public. He would personally seek out publishers for his compositions, personally negotiate for opera productions, and personally give private lessons to Vienna's wealthiest students. He was, in essence, creating the world's first personal brand, where the product was his unparalleled music and the target audience was the entire city, not just one capricious aristocrat. For the era of absolutism, this was an unprecedented audacity. This news had the effect of a bombshell, and the reaction of his contemporaries was anything but enthusiastic. Most horrified of all was his father, Leopold. For him, a man of the old guard whose entire life had been dedicated to securing his son a comfortable and prestigious court position, this act was pure madness. In his letters, he pleaded, he threatened, he cursed. He saw in it not courage, but blinding arrogance, not a noble pursuit of freedom, but an infantile desire to shirk responsibility. He was utterly convinced that without a patron, his brilliant but utterly impractical son would inevitably perish in the cutthroat world of Viennese intrigues. Even in Vienna, the newly minted freelance artist wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. The local music establishment, including influential composers like Antonio Salieri, saw him not as a colleague, but as a dangerous rival. This provincial upstart, who flouted centuries-old rules of the game, threatened to dismantle the entire established system. He could poach students, snag the best commissions, and usurp their glory. His arrival didn't delight. It unnerved the music community. He was an outsider, a convention breaker who set everyone on edge. So, in essence, Mozart didn't just burn his bridges back to Salzburg. He deliberately blew up the very notion of bridges themselves. He was left utterly alone in Europe's most competitive city, without money, without connections, and without family support. His sole asset was his talent. He wagered everything he possessed, his life, his career, his future. And this desperate gamble marked the beginning of the most brilliant and tragic chapter of his biography. How did he manage it? How could such flawless sonic architecture arise in the mind of one man, while the chaos of real life raged around him? To understand this, we need to look under the hood of his creative process. And here, a central metaphor will help us. Mozart's brain wasn't merely a wellspring of inspiration, it was a perfectly tuned biocomputer operating in multitasking mode. He could simultaneously hold several highly complex musical structures in his working memory, process them, refine them, and offload them onto paper in an almost complete form. This wasn't an impulse. It was a process, an almost engineering-like one. Let's delve under the hood of this process, with enthusiasm and vigor. Most composers of that era, even the great ones, worked sequentially. First, they would conceive a melody. Then, they'd compose the harmony to go with it. Afterward, they would painstakingly and laboriously transcribe the parts for each instrument, constantly correcting and rewriting. It was a meticulous and arduous endeavor. Mozart, however, operated differently. He didn't think in individual melodies, but in entire sonic blocks, immediately in full dimension. His wife, Constanza, recounted that he could be engaging in casual conversation, playing billiards or petting a cat, and then suddenly leap up, rush to his desk, and feverishly transcribe notes. But he wasn't composing. He was merely writing down what had already fully formed in his mind. Picture an architect who envisions not just a building's facade, but the entire project at once, complete with all its floors, structural elements, staircases, utilities, and even the furniture arrangement. That's precisely how Mozart heard his symphonies. He didn't invent them. He seemingly just read an already existing score from some internal dimension. This is precisely why his manuscripts contain almost no crossouts or corrections. They aren't drafts, they are final copies. He simply transferred to paper a perfectly finished product that had already resonated within his inner world. This also explains the astonishing speed of his work. He didn't spend time searching and selecting, he merely documented the outcome. Let's visualize this process step by step to understand just how unique it was. Step 1. Receiving and commission or experiencing an internal impulse. This was the entry point that launched the program. For instance, an order for a new opera. Mozart's brain would instantaneously analyze the libretto, the characters' personalities, and the dramatic conflicts. Step 2. Background data processing. Mozart could be doing anything, strolling, socializing with friends, playing cards. But somewhere deep within his consciousness, a continuous computation process was already underway. The processor would select timbres, construct harmonic progressions, and build arias and ensembles, weaving them into a single dramatic structure. This was a colossal, behind-the-scenes effort, invisible to outsiders. Step 3, full internal visualization. At some point, the entire opera, from the overture to the final chorus, was complete. It resonated in his mind in every detail, with all the instruments, all the voices. He could mentally play through it from beginning to end, as if listening to a finished recording. This was the final stage of internal modeling. Step 4, offloading onto a physical medium. Only after this did he sit down at his desk. The act of writing was purely mechanical work, a self-dictation. He wasn't contemplating which note to place next. He was simply transferring the sound files stored in his memory onto sheet music. This is precisely why he could work on multiple compositions simultaneously. For example, while he was transcribing one string quartet, the next piano sonata was already compiling in his head. It was akin to a computer running multiple open windows. He simply switched between tasks without losing context. This wasn't magic. It was a genius for organizing thought, amplified by phenomenal memory and absolute pitch. This engineering-like approach also explains another enigma of his music, its universality. He didn't merely write brilliant melodies, he created ideal musical formulas, universal structures that worked flawlessly. He could take any theme, even the simplest children's tune, and build the most intricate and dazzling variations upon it. He wasn't just an artist, he was a master constructor, an engineer of human emotions who discovered a universal code for expressing harmony. And this code proved understandable to everyone, regardless of era or culture. We marvel at Mozart's operas, but we rarely consider who copied the notes for the entire orchestra while the composer feverishly created another masterpiece. And that was truly hellish labor. Here's a tangible historical fact. To prepare an opera like Don Giovanni for its premiere, thousands of pages of musical text had to be copied by hand, with quill and ink. Every musician's part, every violin, every flute, every singer, all of it was rewritten dozens of times. And this was primarily done by his wife, Constanza. Imagine this scene. Deep night, candles burning low in the room, the genius asleep after another bout of creative fever, while his wife, overcoming exhaustion, sits at the desk, dipping her quill into the inkwell and meticulously inscribing endless rows of musical notation onto paper, ensuring the orchestra would have their parts by morning. Without this titanic, unsung work, not a single premiere would have simply taken place. And here we arrive at the unsung heroes, without whom Mozart's genius could never have fully blossomed. The first and foremost figure is, of course, Constanza Weber. History often portrays her as a frivolous and impractical woman, but this is a monstrous injustice. She was his primary manager, accountant, copyist, caregiver, and psychotherapist, all rolled into one. It was she who negotiated with publishers, wrangled fees, kept track of their endless debts, and tried to make ends meet in any way she could. She was the buffer that shielded Mozart's fragile inner world from harsh reality. She created the space in which he could create. And after his death, it was Constanza, demonstrating remarkable business acumen, who preserved his archive, organized the publication of his works, and in essence, laid the foundation for his posthumous global fame. She was not merely the wife of a genius, she was a co-architect of his legacy. The second such figure, a true éminence grise of the Viennese period, was a man few have heard of, Baron Gottfried van Swieten. He was a high-ranking diplomat, patron of the arts, and a passionate music lover, but not of the fashionable kind. He was obsessed with the forgotten Baroque masters, Bach and Handel. A small circle of connoisseurs gathered in his palace to listen to and analyze this complex, polyphonic music. It was van Swieten who introduced Mozart to the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, and this encounter had the effect of a bombshell. Mozart was stunned. He, who considered himself a master, suddenly discovered an entire universe of intricate counterpoints and fugues. It was as if a brilliant lyric poet had suddenly discovered the treatises of a great philosopher. Under Bach's influence, Mozart's music acquired incredible depth, power, and dramatic intensity. His later masterpieces, including the Requiem, would have been impossible without this influence. Van Swieten was not just a sponsor. He was an intellectual catalyst who opened new horizons for Mozart and helped his genius ascend to an entirely different level. And now, a striking everyday detail that will ground our story and reveal the conditions in which these divine sounds were born. In the final years of his life, Mozart and Constanza lived in such poverty that one winter they had no money for firewood. Their friend, visiting, found a shocking scene. The room was unheated, and breath plumed from their mouths. And in the middle of the room, to warm themselves even slightly, Wolfgang and Constanze were dancing. Not a waltz, not a minuet, but simply jumping and twirling, wrapped in each other's arms, trying not to freeze to death. In this scene lies all the tragedy and all the grandeur of his life. In that very period, when he was perhaps composing the immortal lines of the Requiem or the luminous melodies of the magic flute, his body was literally stiff with cold. The greatest harmony was born amidst domestic hell. It is these people and these details that show us that genius never exists in a vacuum. It is always surrounded by the human factor. Behind every great work stand not only inspiration and talent, but also the sleepless nights of a copyist, the wise counsel of a patron, and the desperate dance of two freezing people trying to warm each other in the midst of a cold, indifferent Vienna. It seemed his audacious plan had worked. By the mid-1780s, Mozart was the king of Vienna. His startup was raking in astonishing sums. He lived in a lavish apartment in the city centre, hosted brilliant academies, concerts that drew the entire social elite of the Austrian capital, and his operas graced the finest stages. He had achieved everything he dreamed of: fame, fortune, and most importantly, creative freedom. The system he had built ran like a Swiss watch. He created a masterful product, and the public eagerly snapped it up. He was on top of the world. But precisely at this moment of triumph, the perfect storm hit, a confluence of events that utterly demolished his meticulously constructed edifice. The first blow was war. In 1788, the Austrian Empire plunged into a protracted and ruinous war with Turkey. This conflict, waged in the distant Balkans, had catastrophic consequences for Vienna's cultural life. The entire economy was reoriented for the war effort. The aristocrats, who were the primary patrons and concert-goers, either departed for the front lines or funneled all their funds into supporting the army. Luxury became unseemly. The city plunged into a somber atmosphere of austerity and anxiety. Musical salons emptied out. Concerts were cancelled. The flow of money that fueled Mozart's Viennese startup suddenly dried up. The second blow came from the public itself. Viennese audiences were notoriously fickle and capricious. They adored Mozart as long as his music remained light, brilliant, and fashionable. But his genius refused to stand still. His compositions grew increasingly complex, profound, and dramatic. His opera, Don Giovanni, though triumphantly received in Prague, struck the Viennese public as too dark and convoluted. His later symphonies, those titanic musical cathedrals, were far too intricate for ears accustomed to elegant trifles. Mozart had outpaced his era, and his audience simply stopped understanding him. He had become too smart for them. From a trendy idol, he transformed into a misunderstood genius, and in the world of 18th century show business, this was tantamount to commercial suicide. And here, we witness the ruthless paradox of strength and vulnerability. The very independence that was Mozart's greatest strength became his Achilles' heel. His revolutionary business model was entirely tied to the open market, to income from concerts, royalties from publishers, and fees from wealthy students. As long as the economy flourished and his music was trending, this system worked perfectly. But when the market collapsed under the weight of war and tastes shifted, Mozart was left without any safety net. Unlike composers such as Haydn, who had a lifelong contract and a stable salary at the court of Prince Esterhazy, Mozart had nothing. The freedom he had so fiercely fought for turned against him. Now it meant only the freedom to starve. A period of humiliating destitution began. His letters to his friend and fellow Freemason, Michael Puchberg, have survived. They are chilling documents. The era's greatest composer, whose name resonated across Europe, was begging to borrow a few guilders to buy food or medicine for his ailing wife. He wrote of his shame, his despair, and how mortified he was to ask. But there simply was no other way. It was a crushing blow to his pride. The system he had meticulously crafted, to compose, to perform, to earn, had broken down. He was forced to move from central Vienna to a cheap apartment on the outskirts. He frantically scoured for any income, taking on petty commissions he would have once scorned with contempt. In 1789, he embarked on a long and arduous journey through German cities, hoping to find a new patron, but returned with almost nothing, sicker and more exhausted than ever. His creative engine was running on fumes, but the fuel, money and recognition had run out. And here it is, the pinnacle of tragedy. At the height of this financial ruin and public oblivion, in the summer of 1788, in just 6 weeks, he composed his 3 final greatest symphonies, number 39, number 40, and number 41, the Jupiter. 3 musical universes of incredible power and beauty born from poverty and despair. He had attained absolute creative freedom, yet this freedom, ironically, seemed utterly unneeded. So what happens to a genius when the world he so desperately sought to conquer suddenly turns its back on him, leaving him alone with his immortal creations and entirely mortal debts? We're accustomed to thinking of the Requiem as a mystical work, a genius's farewell to the world. But beneath this romantic narrative lies a thoroughly prosaic economic reality. Let's be intellectually honest. There's an alternative theory that strips this story of its mystical aura. Some historians believe that the mysterious stranger in grey was not an omen of death, but simply the steward of Count Franz von Walsegg, a dilettante aristocrat who enjoyed commissioning works from famous composers and then passing them off as his own, performing them in his castle. According to this version, the Requiem was not a confessional work, but a commercial commission that Mozart, sick and desperately in need of money, accepted to pay off his debts. The tragedy is that he died before he could finish it and received the second half of the fee. This version doesn't diminish the music's grandeur, but it reveals that even the most sublime creations often have a very earthly financial underpinning. Another alternative viewpoint concerns his famed poverty. Yes, he lived in hardship during his final years, but was he truly destitute? An analysis of his account books, which fortunately have survived, shows that even in his toughest years, his income was significantly higher than that of the average Viennese citizen, comparable to the earnings of a successful doctor or lawyer. The problem wasn't that he earned too little, it was that he spent an outrageous amount. He and Constanza were accustomed to living lavishly, a luxurious apartment, expensive clothing, servants, a carriage, fashionable entertainments. They simply didn't know how to live within their means. Their tragedy isn't so much one of poverty as it is a tragedy of financial mismanagement, a classic story of people who couldn't cut expenses when their income plummeted. Now let's talk about the scale of his creative economy to understand the kind of money he commanded at the peak of his fame. In 1786, following the success of The Marriage of Figaro in Prague, he received a commission from the city for a new opera, Don Giovanni. The fee was a colossal sum, 900 florins. To put that into perspective, his father's annual salary as an experienced court musician in Salzburg was about 400 florins. This means that for a single opera, Mozart earned more than his father did for 2 years of arduous service. That money could buy a small house on the outskirts of Vienna or support a family of 4 for 3 years. These were enormous sums that, alas, vanished as quickly as they appeared. But the most interesting economy is the symbolic one. Many of Mozart's actions carried hidden meanings that were clear to his contemporaries. Take, for instance, his initiation into the Masonic Lodge to charity in 1784. For us today, Freemasonry might seem like something out of a conspiracy theory. But in the 18th century, it was an elite club of enlightened intellectuals, a kind of business incubator for people of a new mold. Membership in a lodge offered not only spiritual pursuits, but also very real benefits. Access to influential people, support from brothers, and the opportunity to secure lucrative commissions. For Mozart, the freelancer, it was a crucial networking tool. And what about his last opera, The Magic Flute. It wasn't just a fairy tale. It was a brilliant commercial and ideological project. He wrote it not for an aristocratic court theatre, but for a public theatre on the outskirts of Vienna, managed by his lodge brother Emanuel Schikaneder. The music was simple yet brilliant, the plot clear and captivating. It was the first musical blockbuster in history aimed at the broadest mass audience. Yet, it was also a Masonic manifesto, a hymn to the ideas of the Enlightenment, brotherhood, and reason, encoded in symbols and allegories. Mozart was killing two birds with one stone, earning money and promoting his philosophical views. Thus, behind the image of a naive genius floating in the clouds, there was a calculating entrepreneur and a shrewd strategist. He perfectly understood the rules of the game and tried to use them to his advantage. His story is not just a history of art, but also a history of money, ambition, and the hidden social codes that governed the world no less than divine inspiration. And here now, having seen his bold defiance of the system, the meticulous precision of his artistic approach, the financial narrative of his peaks and valleys, and the human drama unfolding behind the scenes, all these disparate threads begin to coalesce into a coherent narrative. The picture becomes clear. The Mozart phenomenon cannot be attributed to a single cause, neither divine gift, nor phenomenal memory, nor sheer diligence alone. His genius emerged at the intersection, at the confluence of countless factors that converged at a single point in time and space. He was a product of his era and simultaneously the person who revolutionized it from within. We've seen him as a prodigy who toured all of Europe. But what did he truly gain from that? He became a living musical computer, loaded from childhood with all existing software codes: Italian operatic passion, French balletic grace, German polyphonic rigor, and English choral power. He didn't merely copy them. He absorbed them, deconstructed them into their component parts, and learned to combine them with unprecedented freedom. He became the first truly pan-European, supranational composer. We've seen him as a rebel who broke away from the humiliating patronage system. This step, which led to his financial ruin, simultaneously gifted him the most important thing: unheard of creative freedom. Unbound by the tastes of a single master, he could indulge in the boldest experiments. He could compose music not to merely please a particular count's ear, but to express the most complex human emotions, from bright joy to chilling terror. His tragedy became the fuel for his greatness. It was precisely during his years of poverty and obscurity that he wrote his most profound and groundbreaking works. We've seen him as an engineer whose mind constructed perfect sonic worlds. But this ability was not merely an innate gift. It was honed to perfection by decades of continuous, grueling practice, which began at the age of 3. His effortlessness is an illusion. Behind it lie thousands of hours of labor, thousands of pages of annotated scores. It's the effortlessness of a brilliant surgeon whose movements appear simple, but behind them lie years of study and practice. He refined his craft to such perfection that it transcended into a different quality, becoming pure art. So, what then is the enigma of the Mozart phenomenon? He wasn't merely a composer, not even a genius one. His genius lay elsewhere. He was a master synthesizer. He understood that one could not merely oppose, but rather unify. He took the sophistication of aristocratic art and fused it with the energy and humor of folk comedy, as in The Marriage of Figaro. He took the strict, almost mathematical logic of a Bach fugue and imbued it with vibrant human passion. He blended the sublime and the mundane, the tragic and the comic, the divine and the human. He didn't just create music, he built bridges. His operas are not merely collections of beautiful arias. They are intricate psychological dramas where the music reveals what is hidden beneath the words. His symphonies are not just harmonious sounds, they are philosophical treatises on life, death, and the meaning of existence. He demonstrated that music could articulate the most complex concepts without a single word. He transformed it from an applied craft, serving the everyday lives of the aristocracy, into the highest form of art, on par with philosophy and literature. And when you grasp this, you understand the true scope of his vision. This is no longer just music. This is an attempt, through sound, to comprehend and bring order to the universe, to find universal laws of harmony within the chaos of human passions, to create an ideal world where all contradictions are resolved and disharmony gives way to light and order. This is a design of titanic, almost divine magnitude. And the most astonishing thing is that he succeeded. He left us the blueprints of this ideal world, his scores. And every time we listen to his music, we are, for a fleeting moment, transported into this space of absolute harmony, created by the will of one man amidst chaos and suffering. The domino effect unleashed by Mozart rippled through all subsequent musical history, and its waves reach us even today. He didn't merely leave behind brilliant works, he fundamentally altered the very essence of the composer's profession and the perception of what music is capable of. The first domino to fall was Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven, who arrived in Vienna shortly after Mozart's death, was his direct heir. But he inherited less of the musical style and more of the very idea of the independent creator. Beethoven pushed Mozart's free artist model to its absolute zenith. He no longer asked, he demanded respect. He saw aristocrats not as masters, but as equals. It was thanks to Mozart that Beethoven was able to become the titan who dictated his will to the world. From Beethoven, the chain stretched further to the 19th century romantics, Schubert, Schumann, Chopin. All of them were children of Mozart. The idea that music is not a servant, but a mistress, that it should express the deepest personal experiences rather than serving the court. This idea became an axiom for them. Mozart opened that floodgate, and the torrent could no longer be stopped. He essentially created the image of the composer as genius, the solitary prophet that we know today. This legacy proved far more significant than individual melodies. We tap into Mozart's legacy every day without even realizing it. When you watch a film, and the score isn't just illustrating the visuals, but building suspense, revealing a character's inner world, or foreshadowing tragedy, you're hearing echoes of Mozart's operatic drama. It was he who first taught music to delve into the human psyche. When a pop song is constructed with that perfectly calibrated structure of verse, chorus, bridge, final chorus, you're hearing the resonance of his impeccable sense of form, his famous bend, straighten structure that's instinctively clear and pleasing to our ears. His structural blueprints became part of the very DNA of all Western music. Even the very concept of a hit, that catchy, unforgettable melody, can largely be traced back to him. Arias from his operas, like "The Heart of a Beautiful Woman is Prone to Betrayal," which, by the way, was composed by Mozart for his opera Così fan tutte, though under a different title, not Verdi, or the melody from Eine kleine Nachtmusik, were history's first pop hits. They were sung in the streets, transcribed for hurdy-gurdies, and played in taverns. He intuitively discovered the formula for the perfect melody, simple yet never simplistic, elegant yet never ostentatious. And that formula, in countless variations, is still being used today. But there's also a paradox to his legacy. Mozart's original vision was for living, accessible, democratic music, brimming with humor and passion. He composed for the people, for the theater, for the concert hall. Yet, over time, his legacy was mummified, transformed into an elitist cult. His music migrated into conservatories and philharmonic halls, accumulated a thick layer of academic dust, and became a symbol of high art, incomprehensible to mere mortals. His name became a brand, plastered on chocolate candies and souvenirs, while the living, breathing, sometimes earthy and vibrant human being behind that brand all but vanished. The man who fought for freedom from convention himself became a convention. His music, which was meant to liberate, became for many schoolchildren a symbol of boring, required listening, a chore. This is the core paradox. The revolutionary who shattered canons was, after his death, transformed into an unshakable canon himself. From a lively conversationalist, he morphed into a bronze monument, intimidatingly out of reach. And our task today is to strip away the gilding and patina from that monument, to once again hear the beating of a living human heart within his music. Mozart's story, unfolding more than 200 years ago, resonates with unsettling modernity. Let's overlay it onto our own reality. Who is Mozart in the 21st century? He's the brilliant programmer who left a corporate behemoth to launch their own startup. He's the talented designer who ditched a stable agency job for the freedom of freelance. He's the musician or blogger trying to monetize their talent directly through platforms, bypassing production houses and labels. Mozart's story is both a manifesto and a cautionary tale for the entire modern creative class. His struggle for independence from the Archbishop is our struggle to break free from the 9-to-5 grind. His subscription-based academies are our Patreon, Boosty, or crowdfunding campaigns. His desperate letters begging to borrow money are every freelancer's familiar fear of a cash flow crunch. And the fickle Viennese public, who adored you today and forgot you tomorrow for the next trendy novelty, is the relentless, unpredictable algorithm of social media. Mozart was the first to experience firsthand both the dizzying thrill and the deadly peril of what we now call the gig economy. And here, the main, non-trivial lesson of his life crystallizes. This lesson is that chasing external freedom without finding an internal anchor is merely trading one cage for another, even if it's more spacious and gilded. Mozart shed the shackles of one master, only to immediately become a slave to 1,000 others, the fickle tastes of the public, economic crises, and market trends. He gained the freedom to create whatever he wanted, but lost the freedom not to worry about next week's rent. But that, precisely, is where his true greatness lies. Unlike many, he possessed that inner anchor. When the market turned its back on him, when his complex music stopped generating income, he didn't bend. He didn't start churning out light, commercially successful trinkets to appease the masses. On the contrary, it was at this very moment, in poverty and oblivion, that he composed his most complex, most uncompromising, and most brilliant works. He made a choice. He sacrificed success for the sake of staying true to himself. He proved that true freedom isn't the ability to do what's fashionable, but the courage to do what you believe is right, even if it costs you everything. This lesson extends far beyond the world of art. It's relevant to each of us in an era of total transparency and the relentless pursuit of likes. How many times do we compromise our conscience for a boss's approval? How many times do we betray our principles to be on trend and gain social validation? Mozart's story is a reminder that the most terrifying patron, the most ruthless archbishop, resides within us. It's our own fear of being misunderstood, rejected, unsuccessful. Perhaps Mozart's ultimate lesson isn't about how to live, but how to create in spite of life. How to build cathedrals of harmony on a foundation of one's own suffering and chaos. And in this sense, his story is not a tragedy, but the greatest triumph of the human spirit, proving that one can lose the battle for temporary happiness, but win the war for eternity. In any great drama, there must be an antagonist. In Mozart's story, this role is traditionally assigned to his last employer, the Prince Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo of Salzburg. In our minds, he's firmly entrenched as a caricature of a villain, a narrow-minded, despotic tyrant who, out of envy and foolishness, expelled the greatest genius. But this is too simplistic, and therefore an inaccurate view. To grasp the full depth of the conflict, we need to abandon this image and see the world through Colloredo's own eyes. He was no barbarian. He was a product and defender of a complex, ancient, and in its own way, effective civilization, the civilization of European absolutism. Let's imagine the Prince Archbishopric of Salzburg not as a fairy tale town, but as a corporation, and Archbishop Colloredo as its chief executive officer. His objective wasn't to foster genius, but to ensure the stability, prosperity, and prestige of his firm. He was an enlightened monarch, a reformer who sought to bring order to finances, improve education, and optimize administration. In his world, everything, from forests to court musicians, were resources, assets, that had to work for the good of the state. Every cog in this mechanism had to be in its proper place and perform its function flawlessly. And into this perfectly tuned system appeared a problem employee named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. From the perspective of CEO Colloredo, he was a nightmare worker. Yes, he was talented. No one disputed that. But he was utterly uncontrollable. He constantly flouted hierarchy, demanded special treatment, and ignored direct orders. He would arbitrarily embark on lengthy business trips across Europe, where instead of bringing glory to his employer, he was building his own career. He spent more than he earned and constantly asked for raises. He was a source of perpetual chaos and headaches. Any modern HR manager would have fired such an employee within a month. Now, let's look at Mozart through the eyes of Colloredo and his inner circle. They saw not a champion of freedom, but an insolent, ungrateful, and spoiled servant. This young man, whose father and he himself had been fed at the Archbishop's table for years, having received a stable position and salary, suddenly imagined himself an equal to his lord. His talk of freedom and creativity struck them as ridiculous and dangerous demagoguery. In their world, based on the strictest hierarchy, this was unthinkable. It was a culture shock. It was as if the king's personal chef suddenly declared he was a culinary free artist and would henceforth cook only what inspiration told him, not what was on the menu. This was a rebellion against the very order of things. And therein lies the tragedy of predictability. The system Colloredo represented was strong in its order, its traditions, its immutability. It was designed to manage understandable and predictable people. But it was utterly unprepared for a clash with a new type of human, a person of the modern era with their heightened sense of self, their individualism, and their ambitions extending beyond class boundaries. Mozart was a black swan, a phenomenon for which Colloredo's system simply had no protocol. The Archbishop's strengths, his devotion to order, his logic, and his pragmatism became his greatest weaknesses. He acted in the only way his system knew. He tried to force the problematic asset back into line, and when that failed, he got rid of him. The famous kick in the backside that Count Arco delivered to Mozart at the Archbishop's command was not merely an act of rudeness. It was a gesture of systemic rejection. It was an admission of complete failure. The system couldn't digest the foreign element and simply spat him out. Colloredo won the battle for discipline in his court orchestra, but lost his place in history, forever remembered as the man who failed to recognize genius. His logic was impeccable, but it was the logic of a fading world. It's commonly believed that Mozart represents light, joy, and harmony. But beneath the shining facade of his music lay a profound darkness, and the price he paid for his gift was monstrous. One of the most complex and morally ambiguous decisions of his life, which had the gravest consequences, was his marriage to Constanze Weber. He married against the furious opposition of his father, Leopold. For Wolfgang, it was an act of liberation, a rebellion against paternal tyranny. But this act forever fractured his family and poisoned his relationship with the man to whom he owed everything. And here, the main, non-trivial lesson of his life crystallizes. This lesson is that chasing external freedom without finding an internal anchor is merely trading one cage for another, even if it's more spacious and gilded. Mozart shed the shackles of one master only to immediately become a slave to 1,000 others, the fickle tastes of the public, economic crises, and market trends. He gained the freedom to create whatever he wanted, but lost the freedom not to worry about next week's rent. But that, precisely, is where his true greatness lies. Unlike many, he possessed that inner anchor. When the market turned its back on him, when his complex music stopped generating income, he didn't bend. He didn't start churning out light, commercially successful trinkets to appease the masses. On the contrary, it was at this very moment, in poverty and oblivion, that he composed his most complex, most uncompromising, and most brilliant works. He made a choice. He sacrificed success for the sake of staying true to himself. He proved that true freedom isn't the ability to do what's fashionable, but the courage to do what you believe is right, even if it costs you everything. This lesson extends far beyond the world of art. It's relevant to each of us in an era of total transparency and the relentless pursuit of likes. How many times do we compromise our conscience for a boss's approval? How many times do we betray our principles to be on trend and gain social validation? Mozart's story is a reminder that the most terrifying patron, the most ruthless archbishop, resides within us. It's our own fear of being misunderstood, rejected, unsuccessful. Perhaps Mozart's ultimate lesson isn't about how to live, but how to create in spite of life. How to build cathedrals of harmony on a foundation of one's own suffering and chaos. And in this sense, his story is not a tragedy, but the greatest triumph of the human spirit, proving that one can lose the battle for temporary happiness, but win the war for eternity. In any great drama, there must be an antagonist. In Mozart's story, this role is traditionally assigned to his last employer, the Prince Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo of Salzburg. In our minds, he's firmly entrenched as a caricature of a villain, a narrow-minded, despotic tyrant who, out of envy and foolishness, expelled the greatest genius. But this is too simplistic, and therefore an inaccurate view. To grasp the full depth of the conflict, we need to abandon this image and see the world through Colloredo's own eyes. He was no barbarian. He was a product and defender of a complex, ancient, and in its own way, effective civilization. The civilization of European absolutism. Let's imagine the Prince Archbishopric of Salzburg not as a fairy tale town, but as a corporation, and Archbishop Colloredo as its chief executive officer. His objective wasn't to foster genius, but to ensure the stability, prosperity, and prestige of his firm. He was an enlightened monarch, a reformer who sought to bring order to finances, improve education, and optimize administration. In his world, everything, from forests to court musicians, were resources, assets, that had to work for the good of the state. Every cog in this mechanism had to be in its proper place and perform its function flawlessly. Let's delve deeper into Mozart's psychological profile to truly grasp this drama. The relationship between Wolfgang and Leopold was a classic tragedy of love and control. Leopold wasn't merely a father, he was the creator, producer, and owner of the Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart project. He poured his entire life and all his ambitions into this venture, forsaking his own career. He genuinely loved his son, but that love was despotic and suffocating. He saw his son not as an individual in his own right, but as an extension of himself, a vehicle for achieving the fame he himself never attained. And when this instrument suddenly asserted his own will, wanting to choose a wife his father didn't approve of, for Leopold, it was tantamount to betrayal. He could never forgive his son for this rebellion. Their correspondence devolved into a string of bitter reproaches and mutual recriminations. Mozart found personal happiness, but paid for it with perpetual guilt and an irreparable rift with the person closest to him. The burden of genius, the loneliness at the pinnacle, and constant financial strain relentlessly transformed his character. From a carefree, vibrant young man, he gradually morphed into a nervous, frazzled, and suspicious man. His later letters increasingly reveal undertones of despair and paranoia. He complains of intrigues, of enemies who supposedly want to poison him. The famous myth of Salieri poisoning Mozart likely wasn't entirely unfounded. Rather, it reflected Mozart's own disturbed state of mind. He felt cornered. The pressure to constantly create masterpieces just to earn a living was inhuman. This relentless race exhausted him both physically and emotionally, transforming him from an idealist who believed in the brotherhood of man into an exhausted pragmatist fighting for survival. And now, a story of sacrifice offered upon the altar of success. And that sacrifice was his own sister, Maria Anna Mozart, known to her family as Nannerl. As a child, she was every bit as much a prodigy as her brother. She was a brilliant harpsichordist, and in their early European tours, Leopold heavily promoted them as a dynamic duo of child wonders. Her name appeared on playbills right alongside Wolfgang's. But the moment she came of age and reached marriageable years, her career was abruptly and ruthlessly terminated. In the world of the 18th century, a public career was simply unthinkable for a woman of respectable standing. Leopold entirely shifted his focus and resources to promoting his son, while simply writing off his talented daughter. She was married off to a wealthy widower, and for decades she sank into the routine of provincial life, her musical ambitions abandoned. She became a casualty not just of her era, but also of a grand ambition, her brother's triumph. Between Wolfgang and Nannerl, who had been inseparable in childhood, a wall of estrangement and perhaps simmering resentment gradually rose. Her story stands as a silent, tragic testament to how the dazzling light of genius often casts incredibly long, dark shadows. And within those shadows, the destinies of even the dearest loved ones can be shattered. The price of Mozart's genius was paid not only through his own suffering, but also through the sacrificed dream of his sister. When Mozart's music crashed into Vienna, it wasn't a gentle merging of streams, it was a head-on collision of civilizations. Imagine the Viennese musical scene as an ancient, meticulously manicured city laid out with precise, unwavering logic. Here, the stately district of Opera Seria, where ancient heroes intone lofty Italian verses about honor and duty. And over there, the elegant quarter of the court symphony, where every emotion is powdered and meticulously confined by strict etiquette. Then, the lively but unsophisticated outskirts of Opera Buffa, where servants exchange witty banter. And then, into this perfectly ordered world, Mozart bursts forth, smashing through every internal wall. He blended genres with an audacity that struck his contemporaries as nothing short of barbarism. In Don Giovanni, he makes aristocrats sing nearly comical arias, while in The Marriage of Figaro, he bestows upon a chambermaid melodies brimming with such profound longing and nobility that they would be fitting for a queen. This was a direct subversion of established norms, a cultural earthquake that shattered every unwritten rule. And from this seismic clash, the most astonishing and outlandish musical hybrids the world had ever witnessed began to emerge. Let's take The Marriage of Figaro. In form, it's an Italian opera buffa, a comedy. But in essence, it's something entirely new. It's a psychological drama where the music itself unpacks the most intricate inner workings of the characters' souls. For the first time in history, the servant Figaro and the chambermaid Susanna proved to be wittier, more astute, and, most crucially, morally superior to their master, the Count. Mozart's music imbues them with such dignity and profound depth that the existing social hierarchy simply melts away, rendered irrelevant. It is a breathtaking hybrid of farcical comedy and biting social satire, all wrapped in divinely beautiful music. And what about his Don Giovanni? Mozart himself called it a dramma giocoso, a playful drama. An insoluble paradox is baked right into the very title. It's a hybrid, a musical mutant that defied all categorization. Audiences would arrive at the theatre utterly bewildered, unsure whether to laugh or to be horrified. One moment on stage, the servant Leporello cracks risque jokes, and the hall roars with laughter. The very next scene, the stone guest of the Commendatore arrives to drag the depraved Don Giovanni to hell, to thunderous, blood-curdling chords, and the entire audience freezes in mystical terror. This was an unprecedented spectacle, where tragedy and farce intertwined so inextricably that they became impossible to disentangle. The pinnacle of this genre blending was the magic flute. This is arguably the most astonishing cultural hybrid in the history of music. Imagine a cauldron into which absolutely everything conceivable was thrown: a German folk tale, Masonic philosophy, Egyptian mysteries, biblical motifs. Simple, almost childish songs from the birdcatcher Papageno sit right beside the otherworldly, impossibly intricate arias of the Queen of the Night, demanding virtuoso technique from the singer. Boisterous comedic scenes give way to solemn, austere choruses in the spirit of Bach. It was a true musical Babel, but the miracle of Mozart was that in this Babel everyone spoke a single language, the language of genius music that fused these disparate elements into a unified, harmonious whole. How did this transform the life of the average person, or rather, the average listener? Profoundly. The old habit of perceiving music as a pleasant sonic backdrop, an elegant accessory to dinner, vanished forever. Mozart's music demanded total immersion. It compelled listeners to think and to empathize. The audience suddenly found itself at a cultural crossroads. It had to simultaneously follow a complex plot, revel in the beauty of the melodies, and attempt to decipher the philosophical symbols the composer had woven in. A trip to the opera ceased being merely a social diversion. It became an intense emotional and intellectual experience. For performing musicians, this was also a seismic shock. Old habits and skills proved insufficient. To perform Mozart's music, one couldn't simply play the notes technically. One had to be an actor, a psychologist, understanding the subtlest nuances of phrasing that could alter the entire meaning of a melody. His scores demanded a new kind of musician, not just a craftsman, but a sensitive artist. This magnificent melting pot didn't just create new masterpieces. It irrevocably transformed the very ecology of the musical world, giving birth to both a new, more thoughtful listener and a new, more virtuosic and intelligent performer. Mozart was not only a brilliant composer, but arguably the first self-made public relations manager in history. He instinctively understood that in the competitive world of Vienna, talent was only half of the equation for success. The other half was a meticulously crafted public image. He deliberately constructed the myth of himself as a child prodigy blessed by the heavens. In his public performances, especially his academies, he didn't merely play music. He put on a bona fide show. He would improvise on themes provided from the audience, play the clavier with a cloth covering it, and execute incredibly complex passages blindfolded. These weren't just concerts. They were magical sessions designed to convince the public that they were witnessing not just a human being, but a supernatural phenomenon. This image of the divine Mozart was his primary marketing tool. But where there's promotion, there's inevitably counter-promotion. Mozart's enemies and rivals in Vienna, primarily competing composers and their patrons, actively engaged in black PR to discredit him in the public eye. Rumors circulated about his frivolity, his constant debt, his perceived unseriousness and unreliability. He was accused of plagiarism, of his music being too complex and unnatural, full of excessive noise. The most persistent and poisonous myth, of course, was the whisper of his poisoning, which began circulating during his lifetime. This rumor, which primarily targeted court Kapellmeister Antonio Salieri, was a perfect weapon. It hit two targets at once. It cast Mozart as an innocent victim and his more successful at the time competitor as a cunning villain. This myth proved so potent that it endured for centuries, forming the basis of Pushkin's brilliant Little Tragedy, and forever stamping the image of Salieri the villain into the popular consciousness. And here we arrive at a core principle of information warfare. History is written by the victors. But in Mozart's case, history wasn't written by him, but by his posthumous fan club, primarily the romantics of the 19th century. They took the real facts of his biography and spun them into a beautiful, yet largely false myth. Let's look at one specific example to see how the official narrative drastically differs from what likely happened. Consider the story of his death and burial. The official romantic version claims, "The genius died in poverty, abandoned by everyone, and was cast into a pauper's grave because his widow couldn't even afford a separate plot." This version perfectly aligned with the concept of the misunderstood artist hounded by a cruel world. But archival data and contemporary accounts paint a different picture. Yes, Mozart died in debt, but not in absolute destitution. Constanza received a pension from the emperor after his death, along with income from memorial concerts. She could have afforded a modest yet dignified funeral. Why then was he in a common grave? The fact is, at that time, Emperor Joseph II, as part of his reforms to rationalize everything, issued a decree mandating that people be buried in common graves without coffins, in simple sacks, to save space and expedite decomposition. This was standard practice for most city dwellers, not a sign of poverty. Lavish funerals were a privilege reserved for the highest aristocracy. So, what really happened? Mozart was buried in accordance with the laws and customs of his time for a man of his social status. And the famous storm that supposedly prevented friends from reaching the cemetery was, according to meteorological reports from that day, nothing more than a typical cold, raw December day with rain and snow. The tragic story of the abandoned genius is a later construct created to underscore his martyrdom. The reality was far more prosaic, and perhaps even more tragic for it. He died and was buried not as an outcast, but as an ordinary Viennese citizen whose true greatness the world realized far too late. The information war that began during his lifetime continued after his death, transforming his real, complex biography into a convenient and didactic myth. If the first turning point in Mozart's life was the infamous kick from Count Arco, which served as his declaration of independence, then 6 years later came a second, far more tragic point of no return. This wasn't an external event, but an internal decision, a fatal compromise that irreversibly warped his original, grand vision. The idea was to prove that genius could be free and successful, living off the fruits of its labor, beholden to no master. The means to achieve this goal was earning money through concerts and commissions. But at some point, under unbearable pressure from circumstances, the goal and the means swapped places. The means, survival at any cost, became the end in itself, and the great idea of freedom was sacrificed to it. This happened in 1787. Mozart's Viennese enterprise imploded. The public's enthusiasm cooled. The war with Turkey emptied the aristocrats' pockets, and debts snowballed. And then Mozart, that very Mozart who so proudly severed ties with the archbishop, began to do the unthinkable. He embarked on a desperate, humiliating search for a new position at court. He, the very symbol of the free artist, wrote petitions, pulled strings, trying to cling to any, even the most modest, salaried position. The man who had fled one cage now knocked on the doors of another, begging to be let in. It was a complete and unconditional surrender. At this moment, a profound internal rupture occurred within him. We can imagine this internal dialogue as a conflict between two former selves. On one side, the ghost of the young, fiery idealist Mozart from 1781, who, with burning eyes, cried out to his father, "I will no longer be a servant." And on the other, the weary, broken pragmatist Mozart of 1787. "What are you doing?" the younger asks. "Where is our dream of freedom? Where is our pride?" And the older bitterly replies, "Pride won't put food on the table for your wife and children. Freedom is a luxury we can no longer afford." The world proved too strong for us. This was the tragedy of a man who betrayed himself, who betrayed his own revolution. And then, a symbolic act, a moment etched into history, heralded this dramatic shift. In December of 1787, Emperor Joseph II finally bestowed upon Mozart the long-coveted position. Its title was grand, resounding with prestige, Imperial and Royal Chamber Composer. Yet behind this opulent title lay a bitter humiliation. The salary was a paltry 800 florins a year, a sum barely enough to cover the most basic of expenses. And the duties themselves were an insult to a genius of his stature. The maestro behind Don Giovanni and The Marriage of Figaro was now primarily expected to churn out dance music, minuets, contradances, and German dances for royal masquerades. The greatest musical dramatist in history was reduced to the role of a mere court accompanist, a purveyor of background music for the amusement of the aristocracy. This was no mere career misstep. It was a spiritual catastrophe, a deep psychic wound. By accepting this post, Mozart publicly conceded the failure of his life's grandest ambition. He admitted that the freelance artist model was untenable, that without the patronage of the powerful, he could not survive. This capitulation shattered something deep within his spirit. Gone was the audacious, conquering energy that had fueled him during his early years in Vienna. He gained financial stability, but at what cost? At the cost of abandoning his dream. It was the death knell for his grand vision. The profound paradox is that it was precisely after this spiritual capitulation, in the monstrous year of 1788, that he composed his three final, most monumental symphonies. But this was a different music altogether. It lacked the carefree joy and boundless optimism of earlier works. This was the music of a titan, left solitary in a hostile universe. It was a confession, addressed not to a public that had rejected him, but to eternity itself. He continued to erect his sonic cathedrals, but he did so no longer as a triumphant victor, but as an exile, for whom creation remained the sole refuge from an unbearable reality. The fire of rebellion didn't merely flicker out. Mozart himself doused it with the cold water of pragmatism. He traded his risky freedom for a guaranteed portion of gruel within a gilded cage. And this choice, born of desperation, marked the beginning of his end. This was that second point of no return, after which his life's trajectory inexorably plummeted, leading to his final years of destitution, illness, and an unmarked grave in St. Mark's Cemetery. Immediately following Mozart's death, an unsettling, deafening silence descended upon musical Vienna. There were no grand memorial concerts, no resounding obituaries. The system, it seemed, breathed a sigh of relief, having rid itself of its most disruptive and unpredictable element. For a brief period, it appeared the old guard had triumphed. Composers like Salieri, who had always played by the rules, retained their posts and influence. The freelance artist model, so brilliantly and tragically championed by Mozart, was utterly discredited. His fate became a cautionary tale for other freethinkers, a stark example of what befalls those who dare to challenge the established order. In the short run, conservatism had claimed victory. The revolution had been stifled. But beneath this deceptive quiet, new elites were already forming, and they became the true victors in this story. These were not aristocrats or court musicians. They were entrepreneurial music publishers, figures like Johann Anton André, who arrived in Vienna after Mozart's death and struck the deal of a lifetime. He bought nearly the entire handwritten archive of the composer from his widow, Constanze, hundreds of unpublished works. These publishers grasped what the aristocrats never could. Mozart's true capital lay not in his live performances, but in his immortal scores. They were not aristocrats of blood, but aristocrats of capital, and in the legacy of the deceased genius, they saw a gold mine. The central figure in this new economy turned out to be Constanze herself. From a grief-stricken, seemingly impractical widow, she transformed, displaying incredible willpower and business acumen, into a shrewd business manager. She realized she held an invaluable asset in her hands. She began systematizing the archive, negotiating with publishers, and organizing memorial concerts, the proceeds of which sustained her and her children. She commissioned the first biographies of her husband, meticulously controlling the image being shaped. In essence, she assumed the role of executive director for the posthumous Mozart brand, successfully transforming his tragic legacy into a source of stable income that ensured a comfortable life for her and her sons. This process radically reshaped the trade routes and power centers on Europe's musical map. Previously, the composer himself was the primary value, his ability to perform and improvise in the moment. Now, the center of power shifted from the living artist to the owner of rights to his music. The main commodity became not virtuosic performance, but the musical manuscript, which could be replicated and sold across the continent. Authority migrated from the aristocratic salon to the publishing house. This was the birth of musical copyright as we understand it today. Mozart, who had fought for his independence, posthumously created an industry that enriched others. As for the psychology of those who remained, society experienced not trauma nor euphoria, but something far more complex, a slow process of myth-making. Initially, his death was viewed as a sad but inevitable end for a man who had lived beyond his means. But as his music conquered the world and romantics cultivated his cult, people's perceptions began to shift. Mozart's story became an archetype, a template for a new role, that of the misunderstood, suffering genius. Society learned to perceive the artist's suffering not as a sign of failure, but as a mark of divine favor. A new, unstated societal tenet emerged. True genius must suffer. His poverty, his illnesses, his early death were no longer seen as tragic accidents, but as the necessary price for a divine gift. This romanticization of suffering became a collective psychological defense mechanism, a way to rationalize the world's indifference. The worldview of those who lived through this history was forever altered. They learned to admire genius from a safe distance, preferably once the artist was deceased and conveniently transformed into a bronze monument. Society, post-upheaval, did not become kinder. It merely learned to extract profit from tragedy and transform it into a beautiful legend. To comprehend Mozart, you must grasp the idea that animated him, the concept that was the very oxygen of the 18th century. Its name is the Enlightenment. This was no mere passing trend. It was a comprehensive philosophical doctrine, an unwavering faith in the omnipotence of human reason. Enlightenment thinkers were convinced that the universe was not a chaotic jumble of events, but a colossal, perfectly calibrated clockwork mechanism, intricately crafted by a great architect. And most profoundly, this mechanism could, and indeed should, be fully comprehended through the lens of logic and scientific inquiry. Mozart's music is precisely the sonic embodiment of this belief. Its crystalline clarity, mathematical logic, and impeccable symmetry of form are not simply beautiful. They constitute a profound hymn to reason, demonstrating its power to discover harmony amidst any chaos. He did not merely compose music, he unveiled universal laws of harmony, much as Isaac Newton unraveled the fundamental laws of physics. Yet ideas never exist in a vacuum. They always have intellectual engines, the individuals who propel them forward. For Mozart, such an engine was not found in solitary reading of philosophical treatises, but in the vibrant, live discourse within a Masonic lodge. In Vienna, he joined the lodge To True Harmony, and this was far more than just an exclusive social club. It was, in essence, the intellectual nerve center of the Austrian Enlightenment. The grey eminence of this influential circle was its master, the distinguished mineralogist and natural scientist Ignaz von Born, a man of razor-sharp intellect who utterly disdained superstition and ecclesiastical dogmatism. It was he who served as the prototype for the wise priest Sarastro in The Magic Flute. Within this brotherhood, Mozart discovered what he had so desperately yearned for, an intellectual camaraderie, a community of people who saw in him not a mere court servant, but an equal seeker of truth and light. Here, his talent was valued not for its entertainment value, but for its profound capacity to articulate the highest ideals of humanism. A central concept that Mozart deeply absorbed within the Masonic Lodge was humanitet, the very essence of humanity, or humanism. This was a profound belief in the inherent dignity of every human being, regardless of their origin, and in the fundamental necessity of tolerance, brotherhood, and continuous self-improvement. The entire plot of The Magic Flute is nothing short of an allegorical depiction of the Masonic path of initiation. The protagonist, Tamino, undergoes arduous trials by fire and water, potent symbols of purifying passions and reason, to transform from a naive youth, initially guided by instinct, saved by a serpent at the outset, into a wise, truly enlightened individual. Meanwhile, his formidable antagonist, the Queen of the Night, is a masterful embodiment of the destructive forces of fanaticism, obscurantism, and vengeful dogma. This opera is a magnificent manifesto, a triumphant hymn to the victory of the illuminating light of reason over the oppressive darkness of ignorance. Opposing this progressive Enlightenment doctrine was another philosophy, ancient and still powerfully formidable, the philosophy of Baroque absolutism. This was the world in which Archbishop Colloredo lived and firmly reigned. In this particular universe, there was simply no room for individual reason. Truth descended from above, from God to the monarch, and from the monarch down to the subjects. The world was perceived as an unshakable, immutably established hierarchy, where everyone was expected to know and keep their predetermined place. Doubt was considered a grievous sin, and unquestioning obedience the cardinal virtue. It was a philosophy of rigid order, founded not on the principles of reason, but solely on the pillars of power and unyielding tradition. This was, in essence, the ideology of the Counter-Reformation, meticulously designed to protect the established order from any and all heretical ideas, including the radical, free-thinking tenets of the Enlightenment. The conflict between Mozart and Colloredo was far more than a mere personal animosity or a dispute over salary. It was a head-on collision of these two formidable philosophical systems. To Colloredo, Mozart was a mere cog in the state machinery, and that cog was obligated to operate strictly according to prescribed regulations. His demands for freedom and respect for his prodigious talent were perceived as a perilous rebellion, an affront to the very foundations of the established world order. For Mozart, however, the Archbishop's demands were nothing less than an assault on his fundamental human dignity, on the right, bestowed upon him by reason and talent, to be a person, not a mere possession. This was a battle of reason against dogma, of individuality against the system, of the future against the past. In his music, Mozart resolved this profound conflict with absolute genius. He didn't simply reject the old world, he meticulously took its finest elements, its formal perfection, its dramatic potency, its nobility of sound, and imbued them with new, profoundly humanistic content. He masterfully employed the aristocratic language of music to articulate the deep emotions of ordinary people. He took the sacred structure of the church mass and, in his Requiem, transformed it into a universal human drama of life and death. His music became the most compelling testament to the validity of Enlightenment ideals. It vividly demonstrated that a world built upon the principles of harmony, reason, and humanity was not merely possible, it was exquisitely beautiful. His body had barely grown cold in its unmarked grave when the grand system he had painstakingly constructed began to crumble under its own weight. Entropy set in almost instantaneously. The revolutionary model of the free-spirited artist-entrepreneur, which had depended solely on his titanic will and superhuman talent, collapsed the very moment his heart ceased to beat. There was no external enemy that destroyed it. The system simply could not exist without its creator. It was too fragile, too radical, too far ahead of its time. His tragic end served as a chilling warning to the entire musical world. This is what happens to those who dare to defy the current. The experiment was deemed a catastrophic failure, and for many long years, no one dared to repeat it. And just like that, a desperate, almost panic-driven scramble for his estate erupted. But this was no fight over castles and acreage. It was a furious contest for the stacks of ink-stained music paper left on his desk. Heirs, like ravenous wolves, tore into his inheritance, ripping it apart piece by piece, each interpreting it to their own advantage. Constance was the first to enter this fray. Driven not so much by reverence as by dire necessity, she began to sell off the manuscripts, transforming sacred art into mere commodity. She was a pragmatist, her sole aim survival. On the other side stood his pupil, Franz Xaver Süssmayr. He saw his mission as saving the unfinished masterpieces, first and foremost, the Requiem. Yet, in completing it, he, whether intentionally or not, blended the teacher's genius with his own, albeit modest, talent. He wasn't merely preserving, he was transforming. Then, the publishers stepped onto the stage. They were neither pragmatists nor idealists. They were shrewd business people. They recognized the name Mozart as a brand and began to mercilessly exploit it. They published his works in simplified arrangements, making them playable by any amateur. They tore individual arias from his operas and peddled them as chart toppers. They reduced Mozart's complex, multifaceted world to a collection of pretty tunes, convenient for casual home entertainment. The grand idea of synthesis, the fusion of the sublime and the mundane, the tragic and the comedic, was shattered. What remained was merely a beautiful yet hollow shell. Even his ideological heirs, the new generation of romantics led by Beethoven, distorted his vision in their own ways. Beethoven took Mozart's idea of freedom, but transformed it from a dream of harmony into a weapon. He saw a lesson in Mozart's fate and resolved not to plead, but to demand. He became a titan who wrestled with the world, whereas Mozart had sought to harmonize it. The Romantics embraced his passion and tragic depth, but discarded his crystalline clarity and sense of proportion, elevating suffering to the level of a cult. Each picked and chose the pieces of the legacy that suited them, but the integrity of the grand system was lost forever. And at the heart of this dissolution, like the final most precious shard of a fallen empire, lay the unfinished Requiem. It was Mozart's last authentic voice, his final message, direct and undistorted. It was the purest fragment of his system, music in which he had reached the very limits of human comprehension of life and death. In these fragments, scribbled by a trembling hand, lay encrypted all his pain, all his terror, and all his hope. This was the last shard indeed, where the true, untainted idea still breathed. But even it did not survive unscathed. For the Requiem to be performed, and more importantly paid for by its patron, it had to be completed. The task fell to Süssmayr, and the moment he added his first note to Mozart's authentic lines, a quiet tragedy unfolded. The last shard was saved, but only by encasing it in an alien setting. The authentic voice of genius was forever commingled with the voice of an imitator. The pristine source was tainted. This was the symbolic end to the entire saga. Mozart's grand system didn't merely dissolve. Its final, most sacred artifact was irrevocably altered, signaling the definitive close of an era. The grand synthesis forged by Mozart proved too intricate, too singular to outlive its creator. It was akin to a one-of-a-kind living organism that upon death swiftly decomposes into its most basic chemical constituents. These very elements, his melodies, his harmonies, his ideas, were seized upon and repurposed by others. But the organism itself, the vibrant system where all these disparate parts coalesced into an indivisible whole, perished alongside him on the 5th of December, 1791. Once the grand system fractured, the long 19th century ushered in an era of profound oblivion. No, Mozart's name was far from forgotten. On the contrary, he was canonized, transformed into an icon, a sunlit genius, a musical Raphael. But this was the most insidious form of oblivion. Beneath this gleaming yet one-dimensional facade lay buried the true, living Mozart. Complex, contradictory, often somber, and brimming with a demonic energy. His music continued to be performed, but with what distortions! Massive romantic orchestras, with their lush, velvety sonorities, blurred his sharp, finely chiseled lines, transforming his profound passion into mere sentimentality. His operas were mercilessly butchered, improved by inserting extraneous numbers and excising entire scenes deemed too daring or inscrutable. The world lauded a beautiful but sanitized version of Mozart, a convenient myth, while his authentic radical genius lay dormant, like a manuscript penned in a language no one could any longer decipher. The moment of rediscovery was no sudden epiphany. It was a long, painstaking process, beginning not in the concert hall, but in the quiet sanctity of the library. The first to attempt to reassemble the fragments of this fractured universe was the Austrian scholar Ludwig von Köchel. In 1862, he published his titanic work, Chronological Thematic Catalogue of All Musical Works by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, famously known as the Köchel Catalogue. This was no mere listing. It was the first scholarly feat of its kind, an attempt to meticulously collect, identify, and systematize every single creation by the composer. Like a brilliant archaeologist, Köchel meticulously cleared away years of accumulated rumors, errors, and outright forgeries, forging the first precise map of Mozart's immense legacy. This catalogue became the bedrock upon which the genius's second birth became possible. The true reanimation, however, unfolded in the 20th century, spearheaded by revolutionary musicians. Conductors and performers, particularly advocates of what became known as historically informed performance, posed a simple yet radical question. How did this music truly sound during Mozart's own lifetime? They began to strip away the thick layers of romantic patina from the scores. They eschewed massive orchestras in favor of smaller, more nimble ensembles. They exchanged modern grand pianos for the lighter, ringing fortepianos, the very hammer-action keyboards Mozart himself played. They meticulously studied his letters to grasp the tempos he envisioned, and the effect was akin to the restoration of a venerable, darkened painting. Suddenly, from beneath layers of varnish, authentic, dazzlingly vibrant colors emerged. Mozart's music ceased to be merely beautiful. It revealed itself as sharp, energetic, brimming with drama, and at times utterly shocking. The world heard his voice anew, and it proved to be the voice of our own time. And here we see how new epochs read Mozart in their own distinct ways, imbuing him with their own experiences. The 19th century, the Romantic era, needed a precursor for its idol, Beethoven. And so they crafted an image of Mozart as a divine yet naive child, a trailblazer who prepared the ground for the arrival of the true Titan. This was a convenient but erroneous interpretation, one that saw only harmony and light in Mozart, utterly ignoring his tragic depth. They fashioned the myth of a cherubic Mozart, flitting above the world, precisely because their own age was consumed by the idea of tragic struggle. The 20th century, having endured 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, and existential dread, was finally ready to hear a different Mozart. The anxiety, the ambiguity, the sudden plunges into an abyss of despair hidden beneath the brilliant surface of his music, all of it suddenly resonated with poignant familiarity. Existentialist philosophers saw in his Don Giovanni not merely a tale of a libertine, but a drama of human freedom and its terrifying consequences. Historians and musicians ceased to view him as a sunny boy, and instead discerned a complex personality torn by passions. This fresh perspective was brilliantly brought to life by director Milos Forman in his film Amadeus. While it may have taken liberties with historical details, it achieved the paramount goal. It shattered the porcelain doll and revealed to the world a living, brilliant, vulgar, suffering and laughing human being. This second birth was more than a mere return. It was a profound reclamation. We didn't simply reclaim the 18th century Mozart. We discovered in him an eternal confidant. It turned out that his music, conceived in an era of powdered wigs and minuets, speaks more profoundly about our own world, with its chaos, its search for meaning, its fragile beauty, than the creations of many contemporary artists. The forgotten genius was not merely resuscitated. He was reborn, destined never to die again. And so, we stand once more at the nameless grave in St. Mark's Cemetery where our journey began. We started with the paradoxical question: how could a genius, showered with acclaim, end his life in destitution? Now, having traversed this path, we see the circle has closed. The problem Mozart so desperately battled has not vanished. It has merely mutated. He sought to cast off the shackles of one feudal master, only to fall into servitude to 1,000 capricious patrons and a ruthless market. Today's artist, attempting to break free from the constraints of corporate employment, becomes dependent on an even more soulless overlord, the unpredictable algorithm, the tyranny of likes, and constantly shifting trends. The cage has changed shape, but it has not disappeared. And this brings us to the central, irresolvable paradox of his entire story. Mozart's music is the most compelling and irrefutable proof that the universe is constructed on principles of harmony, reason, and light. There is nothing accidental in it. Every note is logical, every phrase perfect. It is an auditory argument for a world that can and should be ideal. Yet his own life is an equally convincing and brutal refutation of that very idea. His biography is a chronicle of chaos, injustice, betrayal, and suffering. Herein lies the paradox. His music is paradise embodied, his life a living hell. So which, then, is the truth? Was his ability to conjure harmony a desperate attempt to build a sanctuary from the horrors of the real world? Or conversely, was it precisely this horror, this relentless chaos, that served as the raw, radioactive material from which his genius, by sheer force of will, refined the pure gold of harmony? Was his music a triumph over suffering, or was suffering the indispensable, unavoidable price for that music? We will never get an answer. We witness this grand cycle unfold again and again. A genius emerges, shatters the rules, and offers the world a dazzling new perspective. The world, unprepared for such audacity, first ignores, then attempts to break or destroy them. And then, after their passing, that same world gathers the fragments of their legacy, transforms them into a safe icon, erects monuments in their honor, and begins to profit from their tragedy, whether financially or morally. History repeats itself, not as farce, but as a spiral, traversing the same points on a new coil of technology and social relations. The conflict between Mozart and the Archbishop, between artist and authority, creator and market, seems etched into the very DNA of our civilization. Again and again we witness this drama unfold. Only the backdrops and names change. And contemplating this 200-year odyssey of genius, his struggles, triumphs, and tragedies, a final, most crucial question emerges, one for which there is and can be no simple answer. Is Mozart's fate an eternal, immutable archetype, condemned to repeat itself endlessly? Or do we, as humanity, finally have a chance to break free from this vicious cycle by learning to cherish and support genius during their lifetime, rather than merely mourning and canonizing them after their death?